Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to take care of a couple of housekeeping before we get started, just so that you know this is a recorded session. So if you have questions during our Q&A time, please go up to the microphone and ask your questions for us, please. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our speaker, which is Mr. Thomas Clark. He served for the last 10 years as the Vice President for Research and Technology at the National Center for State Courts. Before that, Tom worked for 10 years with the Washington State Administrative Office of the Courts, first as a research manager and then as the CIO. As a national court consultant, Tom speaks frequently on topics relating to effective court practices and the redesign of court systems to solve business problems. Tom is currently working on litigant portals, case triage best practices for self-represented litigants, new non-lawyer roles, and the cloud provision of remote interpretation. He actively consults on a wide variety of court administration topics. Please welcome Mr. Thomas Clark.
So I don't have a watch, so you can hold up 5 when I get close? Thanks. So I'm more thrilled than you can imagine to see you all here. I thought there was a good chance I'd be having an argument with myself. This is kind of an odd duck of a session with a lot of other really good sessions going in parallel, and it might look to some of you as if it's so much kind of up in the clouds that it might not directly address your real day job. So I'm going to attempt before we're done to start high and end up low, and on a kind of a practical level with some specific things. So if you hang in there with me for most of this hour, we'll get there. And I'm also going to tell you, I only have 7 slides. Not counting the title slide. I have 7 substantive slides, and pretty much after every one, or at most 2, I'm going to stop and ask you questions. Because I've heard this speech about 10 times before, and it's getting kind of boring. So I'm really fascinated to know what you all think about some of this stuff. So let's dive in. This came out of a book that was also called Reimagining Courts that I wrote with another guy a year or 2 ago. And we wrote that book for a couple of reasons, but the main reason was because we thought the courts were in a state of crisis right now, in a sense that they haven't been in the past. And we think that there's not 1, but 3 different kinds of crises going on that are kind of unprecedented in the history of the U.S. courts. So what I want to do is describe those to you because they're the motivating factors for everything else I'm going to talk about. And then we're going to stop and I'm going to ask you whether you agree that that's the case or not. I've done that exercise a number of times with different groups, as a few of you know that are in the room, and the results are always fascinating. So let's start with the first one, the idea that the courts are in a funding crisis. That's the easy one. I almost never get any pushback on that. Everyone thinks they should have more money and don't have enough. But let me describe in a little more detail why, as Dr. Doom says, as a ray of sunshine, your world can only get worse. So many of us thought, as we went through the immense pain of the Great Recession and budget cutbacks, that when the business cycle kind of came around again and the economy recovered some and some of us started getting pay raises again, that things were back to normal and we were okay. Some of you have discovered the hard way that, in fact, that's not the case already. And some of the rest of you are soon going to discover the same thing for a couple of kind of long-term reasons that economists and demographers have been telling us about for now almost 5 or 10 years, but you don't often hear people talk to the courts about. So one of them is the baby boomer retirement. We all know that the baby boomers are starting to retire in droves. And if you think about what the implications of that are for government funding, you know, you've always got this ratio between people that are paying into these systems that produce benefits and retirement and welfare and all those kinds of things, and people that are getting those benefits. And what's happened now, as many more people retire in unprecedented numbers and many fewer people are actually working, the ratio between people that are paying in and money that has to be paid out is radically changing. And not only has that put tremendous pressure on some states and cities and counties already, some of you may know that Illinois has been essentially bankrupt for a couple of years now, number of high-profile city bankruptcies, some counties, and so forth. We think there'll be more of that, but we're not even halfway through demographically that process. So it will probably get worse for another 10 to 12 years. So good luck with that. Always here to help. So that's one pressure on funding. The other one is just the continued and unstoppable growth of some of those benefits. So we all know about the costs of healthcare and how those have gone up so fast, and that still appears unstoppable despite our best efforts to reform. But some of the other benefit categories are the same way, particularly pensions and benefits for government workers, of which there's also an unprecedented number, and some of those are also teetering on bankruptcy. I don't recognize enough of you to know how many are from California and might have to worry about CalPERS, but that's one example that people talk about sometimes. So those things put so much pressure on the discretionary funding, because many of those things at the federal and state level and even the local level are mandatory in the sense that they have an obligation legally to pay those things out no matter what. And so as that continues to happen, it crowds out all the discretionary funding. We've seen that on the federal level and at every other level. So you get to the point where you can't afford to do anything except pay out pensions and benefits. It crowds out everything else. Well, that would be bad enough by itself, but think about how this looks from a funder's point of view when that starts to happen. That puts the courts in competition with other agencies that do things like ensure somebody gets a meal today, or ensure that somebody gets medical care that could be life or death, or ensures that someone gets to go to college. You know, those are pretty beneficial things too, and they're hearing those kinds of things from pressure groups and constituencies in competition with you. So all those things put a lot of pressure on budgets and will continue to do so for at least another decade. So funding problem, yeah, it's here and it's ongoing. Then let's talk about legitimacy for a minute. Courts historically have had the highest positive ratings with the public of almost any public institution. And that's great. The problem is those numbers have been dropping for years. Now you'll say, well, yeah, they have been for all government, and that's true. We're going to get a little more specific, but it's starting to be concerning to us for a couple of reasons. One is we haven't done a lot of research, but we've done a little bit of research empirically on the gap between what our customers, I'm going to call them customers, so if you don't like that, just you're going to hear it a lot anyway. The gap between what our customers think our services should cost and how long they think they should take, and how much they actually cost and how long they actually take. And when we do that kind of research, what we find out is that those gaps are big, and they're growing. And they're growing not because the courts are necessarily getting worse, but because their expectations are rising faster than we're getting better. And so the gaps are getting wider. And you can imagine what happens, because we can all put ourselves in their shoes. If you expect a service from someone and your expectations not only don't get met, but they get missed by more and more over time, your support for that institution goes down. And that's exactly what we're seeing. At the National Center where I work, we've done some pretty consistent national polling over the last couple of years, and it was partly because we were concerned about this legitimacy issue. And so we've got not a long series of numbers, but we've got some numbers. And in the latest one, I wanted to pull the latest results. One of the questions we asked was, to members of the public, was if the government had some spare money that they could spend on something, would you be willing to spend it on the courts? And 57% of the respondents said no. Not just no, but they gave a reason, because we offered them the opportunity to do that. 57% of them said they would not give us money because we're so incompetently managed it would be wasted. That's over half said that. And then we asked them a couple of follow-up questions, like what's going wrong here that's driving this perception? And it turned out that the second most important thing by percentage was the way we implement technology. They basically said the courts are incompetent with technology because their expectation gap was so large. Now, I just feel like I'm just saying downer things to you every minute here because I know what your shoes feel like. I work on that stuff too in my day job. We feel like we've been put through the ringer the last 10 years as we implemented new case management systems, electronic filing, judicial interfaces, you name it. I mean, we've been doing technology up to our ears for years now, and no sooner do we get most of the way through that pain and the public says to you, we're not even impressed. You know, you got to paddle twice as fast. But that's their expectation. So, and then finally, the least worrisome one is fairness. I know that there's a big national project right now on ethnic fairness, and there are fairness gaps. We've known for 15 years now, and this evidence is absolutely consistent over every poll we've done at the state or national level. There are clear differences in belief about the fairnesses of the court by the different ethnic major minority groups. But those are very stable. They're not actually getting worse, at least to date, in spite of the headlines that we all see the last week. And they're kind of predictable. You can kind of predict who's going to be more or less happy. And I think most important for us is those kinds of numbers, we think, reflect kind of a general attitude toward society, toward government. It's not something that the courts can really do much about. Whereas these other problems, some of them are partly under our control. So while that piece of legitimacy is a problem and it is real, there's not really much we can do about that piece. And then finally, if those two problems aren't bad enough, let's add a third one, which is the emergence of competition for our services. Now I'm going to ask you what you think about this in a minute, so you'll get a chance to tell me that you think this is bull, but we believe that unlike the past, where the courts essentially had a monopoly on what they did, we're seeing in a number of ways other organizations and institutions emerge to do some of what the courts have traditionally done. Now we can say we still have that monopoly and people still have to come to us for certain things, but the reality is for certain types of disputes and for certain types of decisions, people are increasingly going somewhere else. They're voting with their feet. I don't have as good a statistical evidence for this as for some other things. The best comes right now in the area of civil. And on civil, we do have pretty good data. Nationally, civil has dropped about 10% in the last few years. It's uneven. Some states have dropped more, some states haven't dropped at all. But overall, that's kind of what we're seeing. We're not even sure yet if it's accelerating or not. It looks like it is, but that's still kind of tied into the recovery of the economy, so we're not entirely sure. But what we are seeing, for the very first time, we've never seen this before, some of the for-profit online dispute resolution websites and companies are starting to do really significant caseloads, not just at the high-end private arbitration stuff that's been there all along in small numbers, but in the medium and small size business to business and consumer to consumer and consumer to business cases that are kind of the meat and potatoes of civil for all of us. And we think that that's part of what's driving the disappearance of that work. Which of course the courts aren't set up to do because we're not used to our caseload getting smaller, we're only used to getting bigger. If you don't have judges that have work, you know, like what do you do about that? That's an unprecedented problem. And it's a problem for funding too. Not only do the funders look at those numbers and go, well, I guess you don't need as much money, but sometimes those cases are tied to revenue streams that are important too. So you have all those things going on. So we think that we have not one, not two, but three different kinds of crises that are somewhat unprecedented in their nature and basically going on at the same time. So now, as promised, I'm going to stop, and what I want to know is what you think. So by a show of hands, how many think we have a funding crisis? Practically everybody. That's the result we usually get. I have these ranked by increasing controversy. All right, how about legitimacy crisis? Yeah, not so many, but still quite a few. All right, and last but not least, how about the competition crisis? Yeah, it's about, I won't even say 50-50. Sometimes we get 50-50. You guys are a tough crowd. You're more like about 35%. So we won't beat too hard on that one. So you believe we have 2 1/4 crises going on. So hopefully that's sufficient motivation to continue. So we were mainly motivated, yes, Alan.
So go back to the
Okay.
I didn't raise my hand on the competition one because I have 2 issues that would go in that category, but they're not really competition.
Absolutely.
So one is, I think our biggest competitor is I give up. It's not some other online thing, it's not some fancy new service, it's people just giving up. They're not doing it. They're not filing cases. They have to in family law, because you have to go to court to get a divorce. And our divorce filings aren't down, particularly. Nothing like our civil stuff is down. So if the competition is I give up, that's a different problem to me than I gotta worry about online dispute resolution. So that's one thing. Second thing on competition.
No, let's take that one before you go on. So I have 2 responses to that. Alan and I know each other from way back. I'll just tell you this. So,
Question for the.
yeah. Alan thinks that the problem is that people are giving up on their court cases, and so it's not a matter of being outcompeted by online dispute resolution, but people giving up because of whatever problems cause them to give up. Okay? So the 2 comments on that. One is, and I know you know this, Alan, there's a couple of things going on with the unmet civil. Let's just speak about civil because that's, like you say, there's a choice there, and so that's probably the most interesting case. It's not the only one. We could make arguments about even family, but we won't. We know from research that there's a huge amount of unmet civil legal need, from our point of view, that people never even think about coming to the courts for. They never think about going to a lawyer for, and many of those people, in fact, we now know, don't even think they're legal problems at all. And sometimes even if they did, they wouldn't do anything about it. They think they're an act of God or something. Literally, I'm not making that up. I'm not being flippant. Those are responses that you get. So there's that. Then there are the people that do give up because of complexity or cost or whatever. And then there are the people who go somewhere else because of competition. So we know all 3 of those things are going on in sizable numbers. All 3 are significant trends. What was your second one?
The second one is arbitration clause. Yeah. I think the federal law, which I think is unconstitutional, violates separation of powers, where the Fed say, if you got an arbitration clause, that rules no matter what. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. So there have been a whole series of decisions, and we're probably going to have some more saying, if there's an arbitration clause in the agreement, you can't go to court. Well, that's not competition either. They just take a job to work away from us. And I think arbitration clauses are proliferating in bizarre places. I mean, there actually was a case a little while ago that said, no, we're not going to hold that employment situation.
Just a reminder to use the microphone.
Or usually online.
That he should? Yeah. Yeah, we have a live, it's supposed to be a live mic.
Sorry, usually I think I'm loud enough.
It's a live stream, so.
Yeah. Oh, good point. So it's arbitration clauses. Arbitration clauses are now showing up everywhere. They're showing up in employment agreements. They're showing up when you buy something. They're showing up when you go on the web. And the federal law says we have to honor those. You can't take those cases to court. There was one about class actions, where you can't have class actions if there's an arbitration clause where the person says you have to arbitrate first. Well, I had a complex court. I probably reduced by 25% of my judgeships because those cases just disappeared off the case list. That's not competition. They just took the work away from us. They took the ability for people to litigate away from people.
Okay,
When they put
so
it in. Yeah.
we got to keep moving. So people have been making that argument since shortly after 2000 because of the disappearing trial. That was the first motivation for that conversation. It absolutely is going on, absolutely accounts for some of what we've seen in the last 15 years. We think it is not driving what we're seeing in the last 3 or 4 years. When you look at the kinds of cases that are really scaling up in those ODR sites, and when we look I'm looking at Brittany here in the front row. I'm going to put her on the spot in a second, but she and Paula, as part of our civil reform project that we also did in the last couple of years for the Chief Justices, did a really detailed analysis of what the civil caseloads in typical courts are nowadays. And a number of people were very surprised to find out what cases were actually there in volume and which ones weren't. And I think that the results of that, I'm hoping Brittany can confirm that, is that those kinds of cases weren't the ones that were driving it.
So I know Paula spoke about this at a session earlier today, that we have really seen a drop in our tort cases and a rise in the contract cases over time. So I don't know if that exactly answers that question, but I'm in agreement with you a bit that we're losing those cases because of arbitration clauses out of our system.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, now we are going to move on. So besides these three crises, they were what started our thinking. But then as we thought, well, what do we do about this? We started thinking about how one would redesign the courts in response to these crises, because if something's that significant, you have to make significant responses in order to have a dent in the problem. We started thinking about what goals of a redesigned court system we might have. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this one, but I just wanted to note them as we went. So clearly we need to become more efficient. So that's the cost and time issue, the gaps there. That'll help with legitimacy too. We thought it was important to also think about job quality for judges for a couple of reasons. One is because they're the most important players in the system, and if they're not happy campers, you know, it's like if mom is not happy, nobody's happy. You know, it's that kind of dynamic. But also, some of them have complained that their jobs have gotten worse over the last few years. And most important, we think some of the reform and redesign ideas that I'm hoping to get to before our hour's over will actually make their lives qualitatively better, at the same time making them more available to litigants when they need them. So we took that seriously. The customer satisfaction, you're going to see me pound on this pretty hard, because one of the things that has really worried us, not just for this book, but at the National Center really for the last 10 years or so, is that extent to which traditionally the courts have seen the bar as their primary customer rather than the litigants. And that plays out in lots of different ways. So then suddenly when that script gets flipped and you have a high percentage of self-represented litigants who often don't know what they're doing, you know, and you're forced to take your customers seriously and they're not even good customers, that's a problem that you need to attack. We're very serious about the legitimacy thing and everything that drives that, because in the long run, if you're a public institution and you don't have sufficient legitimacy and support from the public, you're not going to continue to exist as a viable institution. And part of the way that will play out is people won't fund you adequately when they're making the kinds of hard choices we were talking about a few minutes ago. So that's in the mix. And of course, we want to make the funders happy, because that's how we get the money. I guess the one thing I wanted to ask you here, I'm just curious about this. If you had to prioritize, I know it's not either or. We're hoping to simultaneously accomplish all these goals in a miraculous, wonderful strategy. But if I had to trade off some of these things, and you could only pick one of those things, I haven't done this before, I'm just curious. You only get to pick one. Which one would you prioritize today? So let's try this. Efficiency. Whoa, you guys are traditionalists. We're not about efficiency, we're about justice and fairness.
That was the question.
Yeah, I know, I'm not being fair. Okay, how about improving job quality for judges? Let me ask the second question. How many judges do we have in the room? Not that many. Okay. I know. Improving customer satisfaction. Wow. Right on. Customer oriented. You guys are great. Increasing the legitimacy of the courts. There's a few of you that are worried about that. I mean, that's a long-term problem, so I can see why it doesn't win, but some of you are getting worried. Making funders happy. No, we're not. Screw the funders. Yeah. All right.
If you do the third one, customer satisfaction, don't the others?
Yes, yeah. It's a false choice, I admit that. That's why we're not going to dwell on it. Okay, so when we started this journey, we were most concerned. We got to all that other stuff, but we were most concerned in the first instance about the funding because we started thinking about this at the worst point in the Great Recession when everyone was dying. And we were really concerned about this. A lot of conversations about this with the leaders of the courts nationally and locally. And what always bubbles to the surface, we found in these conversations, are these three classic strategies for solving the court funding crisis. You hear it over and over again. I won't name names, but lots of famous people in the courts and in the bar follow one or two of these strategies and still do. The first one I finally called the know us is to love us. If the public just understood the courts, they would give us the money. If they understood what we do and how important we are, they would give us the money. And we know from research that that's simply not true.
It's the opposite. Those who-
John, if you're going to talk, you got to go to the
Those
mic.
who have the most contact with the court dislike us the most.
Oh. And then the second one, which I call the we are special argument, is the one that we're the judicial branch, we're a separate branch of government, we're not like those scuzzy executive branch agencies, we're special, so you have to give us money. You not only should, but you have to, you know. And of course, as most of us know from our court theory classes, there is a mechanism for forcing the executive branch to fund the courts when we think we're inadequately funded. That's fondly referred to as the nuclear option, because once you do that, you've burned your political relationships for a quarter century. But other than that, what we find in real life, and I think most of you have at some point had this experience. I know I have, because I've been in the position of sitting down in small rooms with legislatures and so forth and talking to their budget people and had this conversation. And you make that argument that we're a separate branch of government, and they just look at you and laugh. You know, to them, you're just another agency with your hand out. Really, you just are. I know we don't want to hear that, but that's the facts. And then finally, this one's hilarious to us, the 3% strategy. The bar used to love this. So their idea was that you would just get every state to dedicate 3% of their general fund to the courts, and that would solve the problem. But what do we all know? If you've seen one state court system, you've seen what? One court system, right? They're all different. They range all the way from 1% state funded to 100% state funded, everything in between, and so on and so forth. Sir?
Would you not say that there's a fourth issue going back to the fiscal crisis where people cut corners, and so they came up with these special revenue funds that are now depleted? And so that was a funding mechanism back in 08, 09. I'm going to raise revenue, I'm going to add some fines and fees, and it's biting us now. So I would argue that there's a fourth one up there because now we can't sustain it. The civil cases have dropped and the special revenue funds are shrinking, and so we're looking around and saying we need help now.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that, but these three have been so perennially popular, I just wanted to put them up there. But you're absolutely right. So people love, I don't know what it is, but people love these three strategies, and they never go away, but we know from every empirical work that's been done, they don't seem to work. Now, somebody in this room has had one of these work sometime. Don't bother to come up and tell me that afterwards. But overall. Okay, so then the question is, if those don't work, what do we do? And then the conversation becomes, well, they need to fund us. We don't want to do that nuclear option, but they do need to fund us at a level that's adequate for us to perform our mission. And so it becomes on a legal level, and I'm not a lawyer, so I apologize for that, but I've talked to them, and I played one on TV, and what they told me was, what you have to do is you have to go to the state constitution and look at how the mission of the state courts are described in there. What that says that you have to do from a legal point of view is the essential functions of the court. Well, the problem is when you go there and read that language, it's so general, it's not specific enough to tell you what level of funding you really need to adequately do your mission. It's way too vague for that. Way too vague. And there's another complication if you think about it. Remember the efficiency discussion we were having a few minutes ago. Let's say that we have one court that's dramatically more efficient than another because it's better managed and they've innovated and they've done whatever. It might take twice as much money for one court to do what another court does, the exact same thing with half the money. And so you have to factor that in too. How you do that is anyone's guess. So that was the right strategy, but it still doesn't give us a simple answer. And then finally, and we talked about this a lot in the book, and this is the part that makes people most angry. So I'll warn you now, so like if you want to kind of ramp up the emotion after lunch, this is your target opportunity. There's a number of functions that courts do now, many places, that they didn't do 30 years ago. They didn't do at all. In fact, we've been doing them long enough, we've forgotten that. And that many of these things, the courts were kind of like the organization of last resort. When they weren't being done or they weren't being done well, the courts would agree to pick them up or continue doing them because it was the right thing to do, even though they weren't a part of the court's traditional mission. And so we've accreted these things, some of which are very expensive, some of which take a lot of judge time. So that makes your funding crisis even worse. And we argued in the book that a number of these things would be better and more appropriately done by some other institution than the courts if you could get the right institution in society to do their job right. But that's easy to say and hard to do, of course. But it's still an argument to be made. And it's kind of the same thing with court processes. I mean, we picked up a lot of things. I mean, my example for this is, who does child neglect and abuse dependency cases? Or works in that kind of court? Okay, so I'm going to pick on you guys for a minute. I apologize. But this is from a process point of view. When courts were first doing that, I'm not saying this is a best practice, but this is just an example. When courts were first doing this almost 20 years ago, in serious ways, if you went into that courtroom to one of those hearings, you would see 3 or 4 people there, 3 or 4 roles. I think, I haven't looked at it the last couple of weeks, but the latest best practices for those kinds of hearings has something like 12 or 14 different roles that have to be in the room. Think about that. That's real time and money when that kind of stuff happens. When all that complexity and cost just ramps up, and that's just one narrow case type. You imagine if you multiply that. Okay, so I still haven't solved any problems, we've just talked about them. So then we thought, okay, we're going to have to blow this up. This is dramatic. So what's going to guide us? We need some principles to kind of guide our design of a solution to these problems. If we're going to be that dramatic, let's go for it. So the first thing we thought, and this is why I thought you guys were a wonderful group when you responded a few minutes ago, is that problem of paying serious attention to the customers. I mean, there are some pretty radical changes in how the courts operate that flow pretty immediately out of just being serious about the customer. And one way that came home to me as an issue for the courts is at the height of the Great Recession, we went around with a number of states and did so-called re-engineering projects. So these re-engineering projects are where you're trying to improve the efficiency of the court in a short amount of time by like 20 or 30%. This isn't like a 2% tweak. This is a huge, major, innovative redesign that would save the organization huge amounts of money. And as we worked with courts to prioritize their projects, we built this screening device where you could use to filter, so you could screen on political feasibility and cost savings, and we had 5 or 6 things that made pretty good sense to us. And then we threw in as one of those 6 things, improved customer service. We thought, well, this is a good one. Why wouldn't you want to improve customer service? And some of these projects might do that, and it might be important to the court to do it. So we did these re-engineering projects, and depending on how you counted them, 8 or 10 states, each state prioritizing somewhere between 5 and 10 projects. And then after all of that, how many projects from all of those states and all those prioritizations even a little bit touched improving the customer experience? How many? John says 0, and John is right. None. Every single one of them was about cost reduction for the court, not for the litigant. No single project was improvement in the customer experience. So that's the problem with taking it seriously. Part of taking it seriously are those next two things, which is if you have an opportunity to offer litigants choice in things, you ought to do that. You know, we make all sorts of choices in other aspects of life that we didn't used to and think we ought to be able to. You know, healthcare, we make choices now that we would have left to a doctor 20 or 30 years ago. Even if we don't know enough to do it, we do it anyway. You know, we're all college educated and so forth. One example of where litigant choice might exist is a number of states have overlapping jurisdiction for civil cases sometimes. So you could take a civil case if it's in the right monetary range. You could take it either to a limited jurisdiction or a general jurisdiction court. And those courts differ then by what? They differ by the amount of due process, the time it takes for the case to complete, how much it costs to litigate. And we know from research, a little bit of research, that litigants aren't all the same. Some of them would rather have that due process, and others would rather have the lower costs and the faster speed. But do we give them that opportunity to make that choice? Well, I guess on paper we do, but nobody walking in off the street has enough information to rationally make that choice. And that's where information transparency comes in. We are an industry with no information about what we do so that our customers can make up their minds whether they want to use us or not and how. Except they go and talk to a lawyer at times and they say, how much is it going to cost me to get a divorce? And the lawyer says $12,000 and they say, no, thank you. And then you have a self-represented litigant. Or they come and they say, I have this civil case, and the guy says it'll cost you $6,000, and then the next thing you know, they're on Modria or some other ODR site. So we are seeing some of that happening because the gaps have gotten so large that even with relatively ignorant people, they're still getting enough information to make those choices. But it would be a lot worse if there was really information transparency, which is what we want, because we've done those kinds of cost studies the last few years as well, and in particularly in civil. Actually, it's true for family too, but civil is my favorite case still. We looked at the major case types that most of us would be likely to do, and we compared the cost of the average case to the average award. Okay, so rationality is defined by doing something that benefits you. So if it costs you more to go to court than what you get from the court when you win, it's not rational to go to court, right? So what do you think we found there? Of the 6 major case types that we looked at, in only one of those 6 case types did the average award for the winner exceed the average cost of litigation. So even if they won, they were behind.
What's the case type?
I don't remember. John asked which case type was it rational still to go to court, and I can't remember. I'm going to talk about case triage a lot in a minute, so let me keep going here. The one last thing that I wanted to say is, if you go in, do we have case managers here? Anyone who does case management? Oh, I'm a little surprised at that.
Used to.
Are you a used to? John's a recovering case manager. So, oh, we have one in the back. Okay, we have a couple. You guys are just shy. You don't want to. Oh, okay, good. All right, so for the few of you that do case management, the rest of you, it'll still sound familiar, I hope. What happens when these cases come in the door? Well, the best practice, I mean, this is the part that really blows me away because the center's own courses still teach this. The best practice is when the case comes in the door, it should get assigned a firm trial date. Okay, so every case comes in the door, we think we're doing good, firm trial date. How many of those cases actually go to trial?
1%.
1%. Civil, it's 1%. Some cases, it's under 1%. So our best practice is to waste administrative resources assigning multiple times and tracking a process toward an event that will never happen. Now think about the rationality of that as a best practice. In any other industry, you would design your core business process around what happens most often, not what happens least often. It's upside down. And so why do we do that? We're not stupid. Why do we do that? Nobody's brave enough to answer that one. The answer...
Very settled.
Hmm?
They have to settle before they're dropped.
Yeah, well, it's even worse than that. John's like a Greek audience up here, you know. You can't hear him, but he said it because it encourages them to settle. But it's actually a little deeper than that. What most people will tell you if you ask them, why do you do that insane thing? The answer is, it's the only way I can get the lawyers to move the case forward, is to threaten them that way. And most judges will nod their heads and say, yeah, that's their experience. That the court hasn't been able to take control of the flow of the case, and so they have an upside-down process. Okay. Now, we're going to move on to the solutions, just a grab bag of solutions, because this book was 200 pages long. It had lots of solutions in it. It's always easy to preach when you have a pen in your hand. You're not out there on the front lines. And I'm only going to cherry pick a few of these solutions that we think have a big bang for the buck. But what I can tell you is we did a ton of research on this book because I lead the research department at the National Center, and I got 25 PhDs working for me, and Brittany is a pal. She works for IELTS, and there's researchers there. We've looked at all that literature and everything that's been done, and then further, we have the advantage of doing a ton of consulting with you all in real life. So we're out there all the time looking at what people are doing in real life, not just what's in an academic paper. And we have found that somebody somewhere is successfully doing everything we recommended in our book. So it's not like we just made up stuff and said, you should do this without knowing whether it made any sense or not. There's nothing we recommended in that book that hasn't been done successfully and to good effect by one or more courts. What hasn't been done anywhere, I'll freely admit, is to take systematically all of the redesigns and reforms that we recommended and in one fell swoop did them all, which would really have a huge impact. And that would be really hard to do because it would be so much change all at once. But I just wanted to let you know that. Okay, so what are my top 6 or 7 things that we would recommend? There were many more, but this is the start. First, we would do case triage using case characteristics. So if you took a case flow management class, they always said, you know, manage your cases. Usually people did it without sophisticated tracks, but if they had tracks, they usually did it either by amount in controversy or by case complexity. Once in a while, they do it by conflict levels, but pretty simplistic, and often not up front. So this may seem modest, but we've done a little bit of piloting in the last 2 or 3 years, and we've discovered that this has pretty huge effects. To do a case triage as soon as the case comes in the door based on 4 or 5 simple but valid predictors of case characteristics. Now, one of the problems for you all doing this in real life is that you don't usually have in your case management system database those data elements in order to do that triage. But we've done just enough research to think that if you're doing electronic filing, and if you've got some kind of an electronic cover sheet that's marked up, that you could get access with the software to the data that you would need to automatically, without a human needing to be involved, do a pretty correct initial case triage into an appropriate track for processing. And when I say pretty correct, our pilots over the last few years have indicated that 95% of the time you could use those automated algorithms to correctly put it in the correct track where it would stay for processing. So that's pretty good. for not having to do anything. And when people do that, then they get big rewards on resources saved because they haven't done more with the case than they should. The case gets resolved most of the time much quicker, and so forth and so on. Kind of the same thing with case management. We identified, and there's a website that just went hot out there called VizTool? Yeah, Brittany afterwards could help you with the website link. We just published this tool. We identified in the Civil Reform Project over 100 detailed case management business rules, all of which could be automated. So they're dumb stuff. Okay, they're things like telling someone that this next event needs to happen by this amount of time. You know, it's all just kind of procedural process stuff, but it's stuff that people don't remember, or they don't know they need to do, or it takes a human to remind them. Court has to send something out. And instead of that, every single one of these 100+ rules could be automated, and they all move the case forward, because one of the things that those of us who work with self-represented litigants have learned, and even to a lesser extent with real lawyers, is that a lot of the slowness and expense in the cases is simply process-based. It's the dumb stuff. So this has nothing to do with the legal end of the case at all. This is all procedural. But it makes a huge difference when we automate those kinds of best practices. So then one last comment on this page is this case management role hierarchy. Right now, we teach as a best practice with case flow management that those judges really need to get serious, take charge of the case, you know, review them, keep on top of them, and so on and so forth. Huge waste of the judge's time, scarce judge's time. That's upside down, because if you use these other best practices, you can, between automation and appropriate use of case managers, do most of the case management tasks appropriately without stepping over the grounds on legal issues, without needing to bother the judge, whose time is the scarcest and most expensive resource in the court. And one benefit, I'm getting now toward the one point of making the judge's life better in this talk, and the litigants, by the way, is that if the judges didn't have to waste their time on that administrative drudgery that could be better done by somebody else, they could spend their scarce time actually doing trials more often when the cases merited trials. And after all, that's what they were trained to do. So,
Just jump over the adversarial problem solving.
John was asking me why I jumped over the bullet about case processing types. He's probably finding that pretty surprising, since we wrote about 60% of our book about that bullet. I don't have time to say much about that. We identified, actually we didn't, this was first noted in 1980 something by some other people, and it's been noted several times. It's one of these things that's so true it gets getting rediscovered about every 10 or 15 years. But courts actually have not one, but in a kind of academic conceptual way, 4 different kinds of case processes. And we go on and on about the appropriate use of those case processes and the way that courts are screwing up and the way they use them now, and a lot of reforms and stuff. There's a huge, I think that's a very valuable discussion, or we wouldn't have spent 60% of our book talking about it. But I simply don't have time to go into it now, except to say we think it's really good stuff that you should look at. The one thing I do want to say, though, because it particularly bothered us, well, I'll say 2 things. One is that you see this drift from adversarial case processing to problem-solving case processing. So I hope you can just take this leap with me, since I don't have time to define what I mean by those things. But adversarial is the traditional 2 sides, somebody's going to lose, argue against each other, and so forth, due process. Problem solving, where it's a cooperative, therapeutic, let's get together and solve this problem kind of approach. Started out with drug courts, and now it's spread to family courts and all over the place. And increasingly, courts are doing these kinds of things. All right, so there's 2 problems with that we just were particularly concerned about. One of them is we identified 6 or 7 categories of cases that needed to always be adversarial, and sometimes needed to go to trial. And I don't have time to tell you what they are in detail, but the kind of common denominator for those cases were that where there were big power asymmetries. So it's like the government sues you, you know, and the government has 10,000 lawyers and $1 billion and you don't. Or you sue, I don't know, Facebook, and Facebook's got $1 billion and the 10,000 lawyers and you don't. So who's going to win? You know, those are power asymmetries. And so for serious cases, like where someone could be put in jail for 20 years or get bankrupted or lose their life literally, in those kinds of serious cases where there are power asymmetries, those cases should always be adversarial, because that's what the courts are here for. At the other extreme, our concern was that as more and more of these cases went to problem solving, and I'm going to use family as my example here, you would see stuff happening in courts, well, you do see stuff happening in courts, where it looks like the same case process on the outside to the litigant and even to the judges sometimes and other people that are involved. But what's actually happening when you watch it is that some of the cases are going through in an adversarial mode, some of the cases are going through in a problem-solving mode, and some of them are flipping back and forth without anyone ever saying to the litigants, we're switching the processing mode. Well, why does that matter? Because when you're not in the adversarial mode, people are essentially foregoing their due process rights. So to do that, okay, without people knowing that they're doing that can be a big issue. Have 5 minutes, so we're going to solve the world in 5 minutes. Technology. Remember what I said about the poll and technology? 71% of the public thinks we're incompetent in our use of technology. So here's a few ways in which technology could help solve these three crises. I already talked about the automated business rules with the triage and case management. We've talked a little bit about the online dispute resolution. We think that's a huge target opportunity for the courts to do. You don't have to leave that to the PayPals and Modrias of the world. Courts could do that too. Mobile apps, pretty obvious. You know, 70% of the public interacts with the web now and with anything a court does on a website by mobile phone, so you want to support that. The thing that's probably new to some of you is the litigant portals. So this is the idea that, again, is research-based. When we look at what it is that stops, this is Alan's concern a minute ago, what are those barriers? It turns out that a lot of people have done a lot of things to put resources out there for self-represented litigants, but what hasn't happened is for those resources to be integrated appropriately together so that it's not too hard for the litigant to figure out which of those resources to consume when, which are most appropriate for them to use. And so the biggest barrier we've found is the lack of process integration for the litigants to discover and use that stuff. And without having more time, that's basically what the litigant portal solves. There's a paper that has been published on that I can tell you afterwards if you're interested how to find. The last two, these new legal roles, has been tried only in one state. I'll forget the navigators. Let's talk about the triple LTs, as they call them. These are licensed limited legal technicians or something. I never get it in the right order. This is essentially an idea kind of like nurse practitioners, where you create a new legal role that sits between a paralegal and a lawyer. So they've experimented now in Washington State with doing that. With some success, there's some initial program design problems, as there would be with anything that innovative, but it's pretty clear now that that could solve part of the problem by addressing the market of people who have some money, but not enough for a lawyer, and they just need process help, which is basically what these people do. That's a pretty big chunk of people who can't use the courts appropriately now. Partly solves that cost-benefit problem that I talked about earlier. So again, we've got some reports and evaluations on those kinds of things. The last one, and then I'm done, is the partial deregulation. How many lawyers in the room? Okay, I think I can run faster than most of you. Bar, of course, has a monopoly on legal services. Have to be a lawyer to own a law firm. In a couple other countries, they have partially relaxed that. I say partially. So they've allowed nonprofits and sometimes even for-profits to jointly own law firms with lawyers, and what that's enabled them to do is to bring in from the outside deep expertise in how to make those organizations more efficient. And when they become more efficient, then they can offer legal services to the public for much lower costs. Huge step forward in addressing the unmet civil legal need and in making our constituents happy. So we think that's a real target of opportunity, but it's one that is not loved in this country at all, even though it's been successful in other places. We have 2 minutes, because I didn't want to leave you too much time for rebuttal. If you have a comment that you really are burning to make, the mic's hot. Really? I put you to sleep that badly?
I do remember one instance about the cost and the benefit of litigation. It was in the asbestos cases, that the transactional costs, that is, of litigating the asbestos cases, used up more than half of the total insurance monies available to compensate people for their asbestos injuries.
Yeah, who's the guy from the South that writes those legal thrillers?
Grisham.
Yeah, John Grisham wrote one of his bestsellers about the class action tort scams, I meant. Sorry. But yeah, we don't write about that in the book, though. Marcus.
Yeah, Tom, first, I think it's a terrific presentation, and it's easier than reading the book. So, but we wanted to ask you, you mentioned some best practices, and could you just maybe suggest 3 or 4 courts we could look at it? You say nobody has everything in place, but just, or even the other countries. I know you've been working internationally as well.
Yeah, so, you know, the sad thing, as I said, is that the courts vary according to which practice. And so there's nobody that's doing even 5 or 6 of them. They're doing 1 or 2 of them in most cases. I mean, but I'll just give you an example off the top of my head. I hate to do this because there are 200 examples I could give. Many of you are doing great work, and that's what's so encouraging to us as we did the research. But the one that sticks in my head, just because this is an area I'm working in right now, which is divorces. So up in Alaska, they've got this great process where they do a couple of things. First of all, they have pro bono unbundled lawyers for everyone. And by unbundled, I mean the lawyers have a limited engagement where they only appear for 1 hearing at the beginning of the case. They've already triaged the cases, like I explained, so that they got the 90% of the cases that could believably resolve in 1 quick hearing if it were done appropriately. They triage those people into those hearings. They bring these lawyers in for both sides. That's very important. And it's unbundled, so it's only for that engagement. The lawyer has no incentive to extend to another hearing. And they resolve almost all their cases. And then they added on top of that another wrinkle, which is to make it an informal. They can choose to have an informal version of that, where the judge is appropriately trained in ways that John could explain better than I could, to facilitate the hearing, and they throw out all of the formal rules of due process explicitly. And they resolve an incredible number of divorces in a really short time at low cost. So that's just one of many examples, yeah.
Which circuit is that if you want to go and
I can't hear you, you'll have to.
which circuit is that if you want to get more information?
Which circuit?
For that particular example, what I would encourage you to do on the Alaska example is contact the Alaska AOC directly, and the contact there is Stacy Marz, M-A-R-Z.
And the name of the program is the Early Resolution Program, or ERP.
Yeah. But, you know, as I told Marcus, there's literally hundreds of these kinds of innovations in courts. So the place to start would be the book and the research in the book, and then I'm hoping in a couple years that we'll have a second version with more stuff, because there's so much innovation going on that we could add a couple of chapters just of stuff like that easily. And that's where I want to leave you, because I was such a downer at the beginning, is that people are doing so much innovation that's really incredible, and it really is making a difference. We just need to do more. Thank you.